Hello everyone, my name is Dee Michelle and I'm located on Kaurna land in South Australia. I'm an academic at the University of Adelaide and delighted to have been working with Rosie Canning, who's in England, for the past 18 months or so on our project, Care Experience and Culture. In this video, we're going to hear from Rosie about the history of autobiography and memoir from the perspective of people with a care experience, by which we mean people whose childhoods have been disrupted or interrupted by being orphaned, by being abandoned by parents, by being removed from parents by the state. As you'll hear, one of the first major autobiographies and the first modern autobiography was written by a man who experienced both kinship and foster care as a child. That was back in the 18th century. The beginnings of a significant trend in the popularity of autobiographies and memoirs began in the 1990s, and this was also, at least in part, kickstarted by a man who went into foster care as a 12-year-old. In between, we'll hear about such greats as Anthony Trollope, Charles Dickens, Maya Angelou, and even Agatha Christie.
Thanks for that, Dee. So I'm going to be talking about autobiography in the context of people who've had interrupted childhoods. When I say interrupted, I mean when the writer was a child, there would have been a point at which they did not live with their parents. For example, kinship care. Sometimes the grandparents or an aunt and uncle become the carers, or the children were put into foster care, whether that be official or not, possibly adopted or in some sort of children's home or secure unit. So it's quite interesting that the Confessions, which is regarded as the first modern autobiography by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, published after his death in 1782, details his time in foster care. So he was actually in kinship and foster care as a child. Rousseau's mother died shortly after his birth and his father abandoned him when he was 10. Young Jean-Jacques went to live with an uncle who then had the child fostered out. From about 14, he was on his own. He was often homeless and did a variety of working class jobs to support himself. Jean-Jacques was fortunate at the age of 16 to meet Francois Louis de Warrens, who took the boy in and supported him financially and emotionally. But you can see that in the Confessions, he writes a detailed account of his life from the formative experience of his humble childhood in kinship care and then in foster care, and goes on to obviously achieve fame as a novelist and philosopher. And I just thought that it was really interesting that what's regarded as the first modern autobiography actually details foster care. It took more than 200 years for Rousseau's basic ideas to be formally adopted by many Western education systems, though now they're accepted in our contemporary culture, i.e. children are very different from adults, they need protection from harm, they need love and security, they are full of joy and curiosity and have a natural urge to understand the world. According to Rousseau, childhood has to be respected and revered. Children should not be subjected to threats, smacks, or other punishments. In modern times, we've only recently endorsed the importance of children's voices, i.e. a child having a voice or actually being listened to. Rousseau was seen as being radical and was anti-verbal lessons and instruction. He believed children learnt by experience alone, which in turn encouraged thought. He thought instruction was bad because it was not natural, and that children should be guided on how to learn for themselves. And yet, and here is the shocking bit of Rousseau's autobiography and life story, the man who wrote the long book, Émile, about just the right way to raise children, sent all his own children, 5 of them, to the Paris Foundling Hospital immediately upon birth. He never knew or even saw them. Are you shocked? Because I am. He says that at the time he was not troubled by his conscience, and the only reason he did not boast openly of his actions was to save the feelings of his mistress, the mother, who did not agree with the decision. He claimed abandoning one's children at the Foundling Hospital was the custom of the country, as told by the fundamentally decent men at the dining establishments he frequented. He regarded children as a considerable inconvenience. Abandoning them was a socially acceptable way to relieve oneself of it. Problem solved. Rousseau eventually was troubled by his conscience about the way he had disposed of his children. He considered making a public confession of the fact at the start of a meal, but then thought better of it. And yet, a baby at the Paris Foundling Hospital had only a 2/3 chance of surviving its first year and only a 5% chance of reaching maturity. These are facts which Rousseau could have determined without much difficulty if he had bothered to find out. This, then, is my belief about Rousseau. How can I believe a word he says about children when he had so little love, compassion, and caring for his own?
Charles Dickens, now he wrote an autobiographical fragment in 1847. In the early 1840s, he sent the manuscript to John Forster, his close friend and advisor, but then he changed his mind about the book and destroyed what he'd done. It was never published by him, but it was included in the life of Dickens after he died, written by Forster. Dickens trusted John Forster and appointed him as his literary executor. We've included Dickens in our archive because in 1822, when he was 10, his father, John Dickens, was arrested and imprisoned for debt. His wife and 3 youngest children joined him, which apparently they could do in those days, at Marshalsea Prison, while Charles moved in with a family remembered as the Garland family in his novel, The Old Curiosity Shop. Many of the people he met ended up in his novels. As a way to help pay off his father's debt, Dickens worked in a blacking factory, which he hated. So I just want to read to you something from the autobiographical fragment about him working in the blacking factory. In an evil hour for me, as I often bitterly thought, its chief manager, James Lammert, the relative who had lived with us in Bayham Street, seeing how I was employed from day to day and knowing what our domestic circumstances then were, proposed that I should go into the blacking warehouse to be as useful as I could at a salary, I think, of 6 shillings a week. I'm not clear whether it was 6 or 7. I'm inclined to believe from my uncertainty on this head that it was 6 at first and 7 afterwards. At any rate, the offer was accepted very willingly by my father and mother, and on a Monday morning I went down to the blacking warehouse to begin my business life. It is wonderful to me how I could have been so easily cast away at such an age. It is wonderful to me that even after my descent into the poor little drudge I had been since we came to London, no one had compassion enough on me, a child of singular abilities, quick, eager, delicate, and soon hurt, bodily or mentally, to suggest that something might have been spared, as certainly it might have been, to place me at any common school. Our friends, I take it, were tired out. No one made any sign. My mother and father were quite satisfied. They could hardly have been more so if I had been 20 years of age, distinguished at grammar school and going to Cambridge. The blacking warehouse was the last house on the left-hand side of the way at Old Hungerford Stairs. It was a crazy, tumble-down old house, abutting, of course, on the river and literally overrun with rats. Its wainscoted rooms and its rotten floors and staircase, and the old grey rats swarming down in the cellars, and the sound of their squeaking and scuffling coming up the stairs at all times, and the dirt and decay of the place rise up visibly before me, as if I were there again. The counting house was on the first floor, looking over the coal barges and the river. There was a recess in it in which I was to sit and work. My work was to cover the pots of paste blacking, first with a piece of oil paper and then with a piece of blue paper, to tie them round with a string, and then to clip the paper close and neat all round until it looked as smart as a pot of ointment from an apothecary's shop. When a certain number of grosses of pots had attained this pitch of perfection, I was to paste on each a printed label and then go on again with more pots. 2 or 3 other boys were kept at similar duty downstairs on similar wages. One of them came up in a ragged apron and a paper cap on the first Monday morning to show me the trick of using the string and tying the knot. His name was Bob Fagin, and I took the liberty of using his name long afterwards in Oliver Twist. No words can express the secret agony of my soul as I sunk into this companionship, compared these everyday associates with those of my happier childhood, and felt my early hopes of growing up to be a learned and distinguished man crushed in my breast. The deep remembrance of the sense I had of being utterly neglected and hopeless, of the shame I felt in my position, of the misery it was to my young heart to believe that day by day what I had learned and thought and delighted in and raised my fancy and my emulation up by was passing away from me, never to be brought back any more, cannot be written. My whole nature was so penetrated with the grief and humiliation of such considerations that even now, famous and caressed and happy, I often forget in my dreams that I have a dear wife and children, even that I am a man, and wander desolately back to that time of my life. This piece shows the emotional toil working in the blacking factory had on Dickens, and may also help people to understand for some children in care, there may be some really tragic reasons. They could be going through bereavement, parents might be ill. We just don't know what the reasons are of why children are in care when we meet them, but it's worth remembering that they may be going through terrible sorrow and they may not have much hope for the future of their lives. And I think listening to Dickens, it can help. Well, it helps me to sort of identify with what some of those feelings must have been like for children in care. I'm very interested in the working classes, or as they are sometimes referred to, the underclass orphan voices, and whether or not they exist. Although Dickens was seen as middle class, his grandparents were in fact servants, but that is a whole other story. After speaking with an archivist at Coram, I discovered that in the archives of the Foundling Museum are writings by real orphans born in the 18th and 19th centuries. Foundling children had basic education and were taught to read and write, which is very lucky for us. Professor Helen Berry wrote Orphans of Empire, which tells the story of what happened to the thousands of children who were raised at the London Foundling Hospital. Coram's brainchild opened in 1741 and grew to become the most famous charity in Georgian England. Her book provides insights into the lives and fortunes of London's poorest children, from the earliest days of the Foundling Hospital to the mid-Victorian era, when Charles Dickens was moved by his observations of the charity's work to campaign on behalf of orphans. Through extensive archival research, Professor Berry uncovered previously untold stories of what happened to former foundlings. George King, whose diaries you can see in the photograph on the screen, was admitted to the Foundling Hospital in 1787. Extracts from King's autobiography, the only, well, as far as we know, because I hope to do some more research around these early voices, was the only surviving first-hand account written by a Foundling Hospital child born in the 18th century, published in the book for the first time, and provides touching insights into how King came to terms with his upbringing. Also included is his part in Trafalgar, the Battle of Trafalgar, and how he was in the ship next to Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson, and how he saw him die. Well, he didn't actually see him, but how he was aware that he died, you know, when they put the flags on half-mast and everything, on the 21st of October, 1805. His autobiography ends at the point where he is admitted to Greenwich Hospital, another charitable organisation, and where George once again found his life would be determined by lottery, this time by his seaman's pension ticket at the Admiralty Office. 300 applied for only 13 places, and the second time there were 100 applied, but there were only 50 that were considered, and this time George was lucky. not quite the end of the story as it seems. He was discharged from Greenwich Hospital in 1848, and by 1851 the national census tells us he was living in Thames Street, Greenwich, with his wife Caroline. She was 45 and he was 63. Eventually he did die in 1857, aged 70. It's nice that there was a bit of a happy ending there for him, that he met somebody and married. Another foundling, Hannah Brown, was brought to the Foundling Hospital in 1866. She wrote an account of her childhood experiences, which was published in 1919 anonymously. As you can see there, there's the cover of the book from the British Library. She's quite negative about her time in the Foundling and the way that they ran the hospital. And for when it was written, many of her observations are spot on. If you see on the screen near the bottom, she writes, she was taken by a foster nurse to live in the country and she was brought back to the Foundling Hospital. But what she says is, for the second time in 3 years, I was deprived of a mother, which tells you that she got quite attached to her foster mother and was then, sent back to the Foundling Hospital. She also writes about the stigma that foundlings had to deal with. And this is what she says. And children's happiness and future welfare is sacrificed, even to the extent of their mother's name and nationality, thrown in the world without a relative or friend to confide in, then a bit later, and have no right to the stigma attached to them. Tucked away in that other institution, Barnardo's, is a plethora of autobiographical books and memoirs by former Barnardo's children. As well as this, there are some early autobiographical reflections in the 19th and 20th century by very young children taken into care. And again, this is a project that I'm going to be looking into doing some more work around after I've finished my PhD. So moving forward in time, there are many, many people, writers, not just writers, that have had some sort of interrupted childhood. I'm actually getting to the stage, after working with Dee on the Care Experience, Culture and Archives, that in fact you're in the minority if you don't have an interrupted childhood. That, anyway, is the place that I think, will get to at some stage. Leo Tolstoy was a Russian writer, and he's regarded as one of the greatest authors of all time. Interestingly, and this is so relevant at the moment because of what's going on in the Ukraine, Leo Tolstoy received many nominations for the Nobel Prize in Literature. And it was said that it was Sweden's historic antipathy towards Russia that was cited as the reason neither Tolstoy or Anton Chekhov took the prize. Which is very unfair, isn't it? If you're nominated many times, I think that you should be given that prize. You know that he wrote War and Peace, Anna Karenina, and many other things. Anthony Trollope, he actually suffered so much that he fantasized about suicide. And at 12, his mother Frances went to America with his 3 younger siblings, and then her husband, Thomas Trollope, joined them for a short time. But Anthony was left in England, and he was very, very unhappy. His mother returned in 1831 and apparently rapidly made a name for herself as a writer, soon earning a good income. His father's affairs, however, like Dickens' father, went from bad to worse. And in 1834, his father fled to Belgium to avoid arrest for debt. The whole family moved to a house near Bruges, where they lived entirely on his mother's earnings. An autobiography was published after his death in 1833. Another famous writer, Maxim Gorky, he wrote 3 autobiographies, My Childhood, In the World, and My Universities, although they were often published under the title Autobiography of Maxim Gorky. The first one was published in 1913. These are famous writers who had interrupted childhoods, but who were much more financially privileged than George or Hannah. But Trollope and Gorky's both attempted suicide at a young age show that they were no less happy, and how an interrupted childhood can affect your mental well-being. So now going back to less privileged children Janet Hitchman's 1960 autobiography, The King of the Barbarians. She grew up in foster care and residential care. But in 1919, at the age of 2.5, her name was originally Elsie May Fields, which is rather a nice name. She heard the person she called Gran say sharply, "She's no relative of mine, none whatever." And that was how she discovered that orphans were fed and clothed, but did not belong to anyone. She was also in Barnardo's, and while there, she gave herself the name Janet, adopted from Jane Eyre. Leslie Thomas, who you may know through his best-selling novel The Virgin Soldiers, was orphaned at the age of 12 when his mariner father was lost at sea, and his mother died only a few months later from cancer. I suspect probably a broken heart. He was subsequently brought up in a Dr. Barnardo's home. The story of this upbringing was the subject of his first autobiographical book, This Time Next Week, published in 1964. For those of us in the UK, he also wrote Dangerous Davies, The Last Detective, which was adapted for television. Who has not heard of Maya Angelou and her famous memoir, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings? When she was 3 and her brother 4, and their parents' calamitous marriage, as she called it, ended, their father sent them to Stamps, Kansas, alone by train to live with their paternal grandmother. Angelou structures the book so that it presents a series of lessons about how to resist racism and oppression, and it ends when Maya becomes a mother at the age of 16. So for those of you that have read this book will know there is a very, very tragic scene in it. So when Angelou was 7 and her brother 8, the children's father came to Stamps without warning and returned them to their mother's care in St. Louis. At the age of 8, while living with her mother, Angelou was sexually abused and raped by her mother's boyfriend, a man named Freeman. She told her brother, who told the rest of the family. Freeman was found guilty but was jailed for only 1 day, which is, I suppose, showing us what they thought of children in those days, or probably black children. 4 days after his release, he was murdered, probably by Angelou's uncles. Angelou then became mute for almost 5 years, believing, as she stated, "I thought my voice killed him. I killed that man because I told his name. And then I thought I would never speak again because my voice would kill anyone." Angelou goes on to credit a teacher and friend of her family, Mrs. Bertha Mark Flowers, with helping her speak again. Apparently, Mrs. Flowers challenged her by saying, "You do not love poetry until you speak it." And then she went on to introduce her to lots of famous writers, including Dickens. What do all these books have in common? Yes, as mentioned, a childhood that was interrupted and involved trauma of some sort, whether that trauma came from the separation from family, bereavement because of the loss of a parent, and in Maya Angelou's case, and many other children in care's cases, abuse, which often led to a miserable time. In 2002, Liz Berry in The Bookseller coined the phrase misery lit. It referred to the rise of inspirational memoirs or painful lives as labelled on the shelves in Waterstones. It can be taken as being quite offensive, in my view. It's often used in a derogatory way, as though to demean the writing. Berry said that the genre seemed to come almost out of nowhere, and the consumer demand for these autobiographical stories is still popular today. However, the genre didn't quite come out of nowhere. Preceding and parallel to these tell-all tales, there had been a rise in the illness narrative that began, not surprisingly, after the Second World War in the 1950s, which were attracting, and notice the language here, serious scholarship, partly due to their explosion in numbers. Writers Dennis Potter, 1986, and John Updike, 1990, wrote about the skin disease psoriasis, which afflicted them both. It's also noted that autobiography, which had traditionally recorded the lives of the rich and famous, was suddenly handed over to the ordinary person, recording extraordinary events. Attempts to date the first misery memoir led to journalists pinpointing titles as far back as Anthony Trollope's 1883 autobiography, amazingly. However, Victoria Bates in Misery Loves Company in the Journal of Medical Humanities says, misery memoir must be studied in its own right and understood as a culturally specific genre of 1990s onwards. According to many sources, it was Dave Pelzer's book, A Child Called It, published in 1995, closely followed by Angela's Ashes in 1996, that set the genre rolling. Pelzer writes of being brutally beaten and starved by his emotionally unstable alcoholic mother, a mother who played torturous, unpredictable games. Angela's Ashes won the Pulitzer Prize in 1997, and it also won the National Book Award and topped best-selling lists in the US and the UK, as did Pelzer's. McCourt's memoir is a sad, funny, bittersweet memoir of growing up in New York in the 30s and in Ireland in the 40s. I'm just going to read you a paragraph from Angela's Ashes. My father and mother should have stayed in New York, where they met and married and where I was born. Instead, they returned to Ireland when I was 4, my mother Malachy 3, the twins Oliver and Eugenie barely 1, and my sister Margaret dead and gone. When I look back on my childhood, I wonder how I survived it all. It was, of course, a miserable childhood. The happy childhood is hardly worth your while. Worse than the ordinary miserable childhood is the miserable Irish childhood. And worse yet is the miserable Irish Catholic childhood. It's a story of courage and survival against apparently overwhelming odds. During 2004 and 2008, sales of memoirs in the US increased by 400%. I wanted to talk a bit more about one particular inspirational story, Someone to Love Us, published in 2010, and the mysterious link with Agatha Christie, who was sometimes inspired to write her murder mysteries based in part on real-life events. The Mousetrap is a murder mystery play which opened in London's West End in 1952 and ran continuously until 16th of March 2020, when the stage performances had to be temporarily discontinued during the COVID-19 pandemic, and it then reopened on 17th of May 2021. The play, which was based on a short story, Three Blind Mice, was published in the US in 1950. It took at its heart the true story of the horrific abuse of 2 young orphan boys, one of whom really was murdered by foster parents, who was supposed to protect and look after them whilst World War II was raging throughout Europe. And here I quote from a newspaper. Terence O'Neill and his brother Dennis were taken to a foster home in 1945 on the Shropshire, England farm of Reginald and Esther Goff. The 2 suffered from beating and neglect, and later that year, Dennis died at the age of 12 from injuries he had sustained. It was a tragic story, and if you have seen The Mousetrap, you will know Christie portrays Terence as an adult coming back to seek revenge for what happened in his childhood. There was an inquiry, and it was this that led to the 1948 Children's Act. That young boy suffered terribly after the death of his brother, and it would be 65 years before Terence O'Neill could face writing his memoir, Someone to Love Us, as I just mentioned, published in 2010. Christie took a tragic story and, in my view, made it even more tragic by using a criminal stereotype. We can see that even in the mid-20th century, the criminalisation of those who had been in care was evident, and more than that, Christie reinforced this belief. This is surprising, as usually Christie portrayed her orphans sympathetically, albeit often limited socially and intellectually. Miss Marple used to take orphans from the local orphanage and train them to be servants.
The portrayal of an imaginary grown-up Terence is the complete opposite of the sympathy and understanding shown towards the orphan Maureen Summerhays in Mrs. McGinty's Dead, published in 1952, who was adopted as a child. I was an adopted child. My mother parted with me, and I had every advantage, as they call it. And it always hurt, always, always, to know that you weren't really wanted, that your mother could let you go. This sympathy could be because Agatha's mother was adopted and never really got over it. In Agatha Christie's autobiography, there is a mirror conversation, and she describes how her mother had all the so-called advantages of a comfortable home and a good education. What she lost, and what nothing could replace, was the carefree life with her brothers in her own home. So what happened was that Agatha's grandfather died young, and the maternal grandmother, who was 27 at the time, was poor and left to look after 4 small children, 3 boys and a girl. Her elder sister married a well-off American and offered to adopt one of the children. Agatha's grandmother chose to send the girl, Clarissa Margaret Clara Miller. Christie goes on to say, quite often I have seen in correspondence columns inquiries from anxious parents asking if they ought to let a child go to others because of the advantages she will have which I cannot provide, such as a first-class education. I always long to cry out, don't let the child go. Her own home, her own people, love, and the security of belonging. What does the best education in the world mean against that? The feeling always remained of not being wanted. I think she, Agatha's mother, Clara, held it against my grandmother until her dying day. When O'Neill found out he had been put into the mousetrap, he wrote, "Every audience is instructed not to give away the twist in the ending, but I am not breaking any rules by telling you that the plot is about me as an adult coming back to seek revenge for what happened in my childhood, as if I would do such a thing." That's from page 308 in Someone to Love Us. When O'Neill first found out that he'd been put into the mousetrap, he said, unfortunately, Agatha Christie had already died by then, otherwise he would have written to her and said thank you. He also said that he and his wife used to love watching Agatha Christie, Miss Marple and Poirot. He was quite pleased, but it's interesting that he says, as if I would do such a thing, which I think has been echoed through the ages by care experienced people portrayed as. I had to sort of think a bit more about, why did Agatha Christie do this? It was a child that was being written about in the newspapers at the time, not a grown-up. And the only possible redeeming thought is that when Christie read of murder in the newspaper, she was as furiously outraged as the rest of the UK, and that she brought those she thought culpable together in one house for the brother to do away with. It will be interesting to follow up this investigation at a later date, when I hope to write a paper about the portrayal of Agatha Christie's orphans.
Just to add, before I finish, there are many inspirational memoirs written before the 1990s, before it was a popular thing to do, often about children who'd been in care. And as previously mentioned, Janet Hitchman, Leslie Thomas, and there are many more. Bernardo's Corm and other institutions have in their archives autobiographies that go into detail about time spent in these institutions, going right back to the 19th century. And again, as I mentioned, I hope to do more work around this after I finished my PhD. At the beginning of the PhD journey, I wondered where the real orphan voices were. The orphan stories of my childhood were written by middle and upper-class privileged writers, and therefore, much as I enjoyed the adventures, and I'm pretty sure they helped me, when I grew up, I noticed a lack of anything out there I could identify with or written by my tribe. Also, what my research has shown and is showing me that those children writing as adults are part of a social movement. These misery narratives are confessional in form, but they bear witness, sometimes angrily, to the failure of family life, the abuse of children both in and out of care, and wider societal failure. For over 200 years, we have been hearing the same story from children in orphanages, children's homes, secure units, fostered, adopted, or with some sort of interrupted childhood. Misery lit has put paid to any notion that the churches are good or that orphanages were safe places to be, and that the idea of only one sort of nuclear family being the ideal is slowly being eroded too. Lindsay Farrell, who wrote The Wacky Man in 2016, said in her 2018 Miss Lexia article, "Misery Lit forces us to face the realities of society. It builds our understanding, develops our empathy. It can teach us so much about abuse and illness, and crucially about healing and coping. It also empowers voices that are all too often marginalised. She says we need a great many more of their stories, not less. And it is time to drop the misery label. Just call it literature. Thank you.